the bad part of town. The gravity of his next decision was not lost on Max Halstead. The first song you play in a new car decides that car's fate. Ideally, he would have picked something up on the radio. That was more his style, but the '98 Ford Taurus didn't have an antenna, so all it could pick up was static. He meant to check the radio before he bought the car, but he got all flustered after having to make an 11-point turn just to pull the thing out of the used car lot for a test drive. He'd bet good money that dealers parked those cars tight on purpose, just to throw off desperate teenagers. Unfortunately, he'd spent good money on the car, so that bet would have to wait. After scouring his phone for a tune, he landed on Little Pink Houses by John Cougar Mellencamp. Mellencamp had a way of making songs sound American without sounding country at all. Folks older than Max might have explained that sound as rock and roll, but Max wasn't too worried about the distinction. In fact, with the windows down and the music blaring and a newfound freedom, Max rolled out of the used car lot without any worries to speak of. Max cruised around town, hunting for new routes to his favorite places. He drove by each of his friends' houses, taking note of how much quicker he could get there by car than by bike. He hit the McDonald's drive-thru to get a McChicken, then, an hour later, drove through the Tasty Cream to get a soft-serve cone. He tossed the trash on the floor of the passenger side. His car, his rules. Tasty Cream was in the bad part of town anyways. That was a fine enough excuse not to leave the car. There wasn't really a reason for it to be the bad part of town. It only certainly wasn't the good part of town. And nobody with money lived there. Nobody lived there for very long either. Max had known a few kids from this part of town in grade school. They had all moved away not long after they arrived. It was so dependable you could almost set your clock to it. If someone moved into the good part of town, they'd stick around and become an involved member of the community. If they lived in the bad part, they'd be gone in a year or so. Even people who moved from the good part to the bad part sort of disappeared from town life after a while. They stopped attending book clubs, missed potlucks, and eventually moved away. He was thinking specifically of his old teacher, Miss Weissman. She was a 20-something English teacher who seemed to get on very well with the community before she up and left mid-semester of Max's sophomore year. She wasn't the only one, but she was the first one Max really noticed. She was a nice lady, and she directed all the school plays for free. She was constantly bussing kids back and forth from rehearsals in her iconic red Buick with a little smiley face antenna ornament. She was a hit around town, so it was pretty jarring when she got eaten up by the cursed land past the Tasty Cream. Max considered his culpability in the curse as someone who spends his parents' money elsewhere. Not one to promote wealth inequality, he decided to do something about it. He would have patted himself on the back, but he needed both hands to steer the car out of the Tasty Cream drive-thru and into the bad part of town. A mile or so down the road, Max became certain that he had never in his life been this far past the Tasty Cream. He didn't know if his parents drove around this part of town or maybe just never needed anything in this direction. But whatever the reason, this place was totally unfamiliar. He had definitely not been here before, which seemed crazy because this place was huge. The longer he drove, the more this seemed less like the bad part of a larger town and more just like half the entire town, or more even. The blocks and blocks of little houses appeared to be endless. Some were blue, some were green, some were pink. They weren't quite how Max had expected them to be either. In fact, they were all kinda nice. Small, but nice. It was really charming. There were picket fences, mailboxes, gardens, and beautifully kept lawns. The only thing that seemed to be missing was stores. He had driven 10 or 15 miles and hadn't seen a single shop. Max weaved on and off of different roads, trying to find out where all the businesses were. But no luck. Maybe that was why this development was so unpopular. There wasn't even a gas station nearby, or a park, or a grocer. Just miles and miles of little houses. To do pretty much anything, these people would have to go into town. What people? He thought as he cruised down the block. He hadn't seen a single person walking their dog or going for a run. And where would they? There were no sidewalks. What a design flaw. All these beautiful homes and no sidewalks? Upon closer inspection, he noticed another, far stranger flaw in this neighborhood. Each of the houses had a one-car garage, but none, not a single one, had a paved driveway. Instead, it was just grass lawn leading up to the door of the garage. Max couldn't help but chuckle to himself at the sheer absurdity of it. He felt a little better about his privilege, knowing that this wasn't a struggling low-income neighborhood that he'd subconsciously been avoiding, but more like a commercial development project gone horribly wrong. Max noticed the sun setting and pulled out his phone to GPS the way home. "Oh, shit," he groaned as he watched the battery bar tick from 3% to 2% to 1%. His music cut off, and the all-damning T-Mobile jingle rang out, leaving the phone dead as a doornail in his hands. He cursed his rotten luck, wondering why the last 10% of a battery was so much less dependable than the first 90. He'd have to table that question because he was quite a ways from home now and hopelessly lost. The roads were awfully narrow, so Max pulled onto one of the garage side lawns to turn around. He was going to try to retrace his steps. When he popped the car in reverse, he was startled to hear the wheels spinning helplessly behind him. After a second, they caught and almost sent him careening into the mailbox of a neighboring house. He slammed on the brakes and burnt a good chunk of rubber and dignity in the process. He peered over at the lawn to assess the damage. If it wasn't that bad, he might not have to drain his remaining dignity to go and apologize. His lucky day. Or some divine intervention, more like. The longer he looked, the more peculiar it was. The lawn was completely untouched. There was no trace of spinning tires or even a soft track of flattened grass. He looked down the block to make sure he was looking at the right lawn. He was. He took a nice, deep breath and pulled away as the sky deepened from pink to purple. It wasn't until the sky was a crisp black that Max began to truly worry about getting home. He was on less than a quarter of a tank now, and nothing looked remotely familiar. The same little houses, the same little lawns. They seemed to be spawning like NPCs in an open-world video game. They were so similar that he couldn't tell if he was retracing his steps or moving deeper into the labyrinth. The area looked different at night, so there was no way to be sure, especially since no one had the sense to put up lampposts or any sort of road lighting at all. Where the hell are the lampposts? Max muttered in frustration. He was starting to get a feeling he hadn't had since he was maybe 6 or 7. That feeling he'd get in a store when he'd look up and his parents were nowhere in sight. Back then, it was a combination of fear of being lost and the dreaded embarrassment of having his name called over the PA system. There was no PA system in the bad part of town, that was for sure. If he ran out of gas, which was becoming a real possibility, then he would have to knock on some stranger's door and ask to use their phone. He shuddered at the thought and focused harder on the road. He had to find his way out of this place. He noticed a funky little road paved less carefully than the rest. It looked like a real road, like people had actually driven on it. Nothing like the eerily smooth pavement he'd been gliding on for over... How long had it been? An hour? Hour and a half? 2? He reached for his phone to check the time, then remembered, dead as a doornail. He turned down the road, relieved to have found something that was at least different. Surely this would lead to some road names he recognized. The road led deep into a tree line. It wound a bit, but There were no roads leading off of it, so there was no chance of getting lost. At least, no chance of getting any more lost. Here there were some streetlights on the road, and that boosted Max's confidence that he was heading towards civilization. Eventually, the road straightened out and the tree cover opened into a large parking lot. There were 10 or 12 cars and a lot of about 80 spaces. An apartment building loomed over the lot. It was ugly and clearly old. There was nothing inviting about it. Max had seen buildings like this one before. They usually smelled like smoke. It was cheap housing. This is what he'd expected the bad part of town to look like. This was the place he'd been secretly hoping didn't exist. The last layer of hell for those unfortunate enough to make minimum wage in an expensive town. Strange that it was hidden way out here, though, with just one way in and out. It was as if the town was trying to trap them inside. Max shuddered. Max parked in the spot closest to the entrance. He figured he'd give the doorbell a try. The receptionist would probably be able to give him directions. At the very least, they'd have a phone he could use. He got out of the car and marched toward the building. As he got closer, he began to notice the extent of dilapidation. There were vines reaching up from the foundation and crawling along the walls and over the windows. In the dim moonlight, he couldn't quite tell what color the building was, but he could see that it was covered in damp moss. As his eyes traced the silhouette of the building, a light in the upper left window flickered on. Then another. Then, one by one, every light in the building cut on and illuminated the lot. Max stumbled back, unsure of how to proceed. Silhouettes began to rise in each of the windows. He could see hands and heads rising up, backlit in the light of their rooms. Bang! 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 The silhouettes pounded their fists on the windows with all their might. All of a sudden, the building was alive with the deafening sound of human meat colliding with the structure. Max could see that some were ramming their shoulders or even their heads into the window, trying desperately to escape. Max turned tail and bolted to his car. Under the new light, he could see the other cars in the lot more clearly. They were all covered in vines and moss, just like the building. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Something that, even in all this terror, made him stop in his tracks. Dangling on the broken antenna of a car almost completely consumed by moss was a little smiley face ornament. Miss Weissman, he thought. A thought was all he could spare. He continued on to his car, got in and slammed the door hard. The moment the door shut, the lot went dark and silent. The only sound in the lot was that of his own breath, still heavy but slowing down as he regained an ounce or two of composure. Max looked up at the building. The lights had gone, the silhouettes with them. His eyes scanned the building again for any trace of the horror he just witnessed. They fell on the door. The open door. The open door! Max cranked the car into reverse just as a black, shadowy figure darted out of the door towards him. It looked like it was on all fours, but he couldn't be sure. As soon as he put a few yards between him and the creature, he whipped the car around and barreled back onto the old road. After a mile or so, Max worked up the courage to check the rear view again. Nothing. He had left it in the dust, along with that awful building. And all those... were they people? Ghosts, it felt more like. The tree line opened out into the neighborhood he'd gotten so lost in before. Thank God, he muttered to himself. As if in reply, the Taurus began to sputter and spit. No, 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 no! Shit! The car rolled to a stop in front of a little pink house. He pulled into the driveway. After the scare he just had, he could stomach a little embarrassment if it would get him home. He walked up to the door and rang the bell. No response. He looked down the street to see if anyone had their lights on. The street lamps were lit, so it Had to be at least past 8. He suspected it was probably closer to 9 or 9:30. He'd hate to be a bother and wake somebody. He looked down the street again. Street lamps. There were street lamps all down the block now. Ice ran through his veins as the next bomb dropped. There weren't any driveways the last time he came through here. He was sure of it. He noticed it. Jesus Christ, he gasped. He looked back at the doorway. Nearly normal except for one thing. There was no knob. A sense of dread washed over Max as he started to piece together the new information. It was how he imagined a fly must feel when it starts to get tangled in a web. It was the feeling you get when you realize you're about to lose a game of chess. That moment of dawning comprehension that precedes something awful. Whatever this part of town was, it wasn't made for people. It almost felt like it was made to convince people it was a neighborhood. Like some alien or monster had sat down studying neighborhoods so it could lure in careless wanderers. Like that spider. Like that spider with the trap door. Only instead of leaves and sticks, it uses picket fences and mowed lawns. Max heard a little click behind him and looked down. There, right where it should be, was a glistening brass doorknob. Can it hear me? Max thought. Can it hear me think? Then, the last piece fell into place. Those people in the windows, they weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to warn me. And as the shadowy beast leapt out of the trees toward Max, all he could think about was the first song he had played in the car. Little Pink Houses by John Cougar Mellencamp. Maybe he picked the wrong one.